Paper Mario the Origami King is Intelligent Systems and Nintendo's latest entry into the Paper Mario franchise, and carries on the series' 13-year-long tradition of furthering division among the fanbase. Though granted, this is arguably one of the lesser divisive games within that time frame, and possibly the best entry in my opinion since 2004's beloved hit, The Thousand Year Door. But where does all of this division come from? Well, as was stated recently by series producer Kensuke Tanabe in an interview with PC Games, changing the battle system with each entry is viewed by the team as a necessity to the franchise, and though that alone isn't solely responsible for all the mixed reception throughout the years, it is what I believe to be the largest perpetrator. With the Origami King, we see the series' closest return to form, yet for many, it still leaves much to be desired. And so before we get into this review, it's important to know upfront what exactly this game is and what exactly it isn't. What this game isn't, despite its relative return to form, is an RPG akin to the series' first two entries. What it is an adventure game. Despite the pseudo-traditional turn-based combat with real-time elements, it lacks the experience system and character leveling and progression systems I find to be a necessity when defining something as an RPG. It's true your character does gain stat increases as the game goes along, but how these stat increases are gained are far more comparable to adventure games such as The Legend of Zelda, and far less comparable to anything I would personally call an RPG. Now we'll get into more of all of that later, and hopefully it'll be more obvious then why I say this is not an RPG, but is rather an adventure game. But it is important I establish all this up front, just so you know where to put your expectations, and how this review is going to unfold. But for now, let's get into the story and see how Mario will once again find himself on a familiar quest of having to save Princess Peach and the Mushroom Kingdom. Oh, and I almost forgot. Like, comment, subscribe. Like any Mario game, this adventure begins wonderfully simple. Mario and Luigi Mario awake bright and early to head to Toad Town to take part in the year's Origami Festival. Only when they arrive, they find the town barren, desolate, and seemingly abandoned. Despite the town itself looking cheery, the emptiness immediately hits you with an eerie and ominous feeling. The brothers continue undeterred and head to Peach's castle, which they soon find is also pretty desolate. They venture into the innermost chambers of the castle, the Great Hall, a hall clearly built to strike our millennial generation with warm, syrupy, thick IV drips of nostalgia. And I won't lie, it feels good. To contrast that warm feeling, however, Princess Peach arrives on scene as somebody not quite herself. Somebody a little more creased than usual. After a brief conversation, it becomes clear what's going on. Princess Peach has been manipulated by Ollie, an Origami King brought to life and with the ability to take all flat paper creatures under his control and into the third dimension. Things escalate quickly here when Ollie, and let's face it, his name really should have been translated to Ori, for origami, but hey, maybe a certain creature of a blind forest made that a little tough to do. Things escalate quickly when Ollie uses his magical craft powers to wrap the kingdom in 5 ribbons and transport it to a distant mountaintop, throwing Mario, Luigi, and Olivia, their new origami companion, from its innards to crash land in various places around Toad Town. The ribbons that move the castle now act as a cocoon of sorts, blocking all outsiders from getting in. So Mario and Olivia, with their band of rotating companions, travel the world to uproot and unanchor the ribbons one by one, so they might eventually get into the castle, overthrow Ollie and his devious plan to fold the world, save the princess, and reinstate the virtues of flat justice from coast to shiny coast. It's a simple premise, but one that's executed much better than I was thinking it would be. And though it would be hard to mess up the execution too bad, they really do implement the origami and their potential threat to the real world really well. Part of me thought for sure that the origami threat would be a little too meta and too on the nose or too literal for what Paper Mario as a franchise is. That turning the paper aspects from mostly being an aesthetic choice into a narrative reality was a huge mistake. But to my immense pleasure, it really worked. And it's all fleshed out and brought to life with some of the absolute best witty character dialogue and fantastic and cute animations that the medium has to offer. Of course, Mario doesn't talk, he doesn't even make sounds, but every other character you meet along the way, no matter how minute or unimportant to the story they are, has something to say that is specifically written to make you smile. Whether from a good pun, a bad pun, or a shockingly dark or pitiful comment so unexpected I couldn't help it, I found myself smiling from just about every interaction. Exploring the world and talking to the characters is a constant treat, which makes one of the game's main tasks that much more rewarding to take part in. One of the main things you'll be doing while exploring is looking for the hidden toads. They'll often be folded into the shape of everyday things, random insects and animals, or otherwise just stuck in a predicament that they need you to help them out of. When you free them, most will greet you with a small reward and a witty anecdote. They will then later join you in battle as a spectator from the bleachers, able to be called upon for assistance, which we'll get into more later. Paper Mario as a series has always been out to charm, and dare I say, even though this won't top the Thousand Year Door as my favorite entry in the franchise, I do find it more charming overall. But not every decision or interaction along the way is a hit. It's rare, but there were a couple instances where I felt missteps were taken. High tension and high drama moments that for short stints create some detrimental tonal whiplash in the game, and feels like they honestly don't belong at all. By far the biggest being a certain character's death. I won't get into who dies or how, but though it's contextualized in a way that it's supposed to feel like it's a good thing, it comes off as way too dramatic for this lighthearted, E-rated adventure. I kept assuring myself for a short while after the event that they couldn't possibly leave the character dead, that they wouldn't really do that in a game like this, and that it was probably just going to be a fake out that we can all laugh about later. But that supposition never came to pass. It really was just a dark, dramatic moment wedged into the middle of this otherwise relentlessly charming romp. Ultimately, I have almost nothing but praise for how this game handles its writing and its characters. We don't have a very deep or insanely fleshed out cast or anything, but then that's not exactly what this game set out to do. It set out to charm you with its wit and its world, and it succeeds on levels that far surpass most of what gaming has to offer. But how does it fare as an adventure game? Let's take a deeper look at the zones and the dungeons now. Well, where this is an adventure game and not an RPG, it's easy to say that the dungeon designs are significantly better than you'd see from the average RPG dungeon, but maybe not as deep, grand, or expansive as a Legend of Zelda title or a Darksiders game. I wouldn't necessarily account that as a negative thing, however. There's a total of 6 main dungeons, each located in their own unique territory. Most territories, with some help from the fixed camera angles, are incredibly scenic and well designed. Though the goal in each territory is to find and gain access to the dungeon and the ribbon held within it, how you go about that task is always different. The game is always feeding you new gimmicks to use to reach your goals, and this really helps it stay feeling fresh from start to finish. However, around the mid-game we do hit zones that maybe don't look as neat or catered as the earlier ones. The desert, for instance, looks pretty boring, as deserts usually do in video games. But then deserts by and large don't have much to work with in real life, and despite all the empty space, there's still loads to do, and it's made easily traversable with a unique chapter-specific vehicle to get around in. Pretty late into the game too, we hit a section that is designed as if a spiritual successor to Wind Waker, my absolute favorite Legend of Zelda game. But again, it's an ocean. Like the desert before it, oceans don't look that exciting, and they don't give the designers that much to work with. Yet, they still pull it off incredibly well. You fill your time in this arc by sailing the seas, filling in your sea chart and mapping the islands and treasures, anchoring at islands to solve island-wide puzzles, and eventually overcoming challenges to prove your wisdom, your power, and your courage. It's frankly just a really fun time. I mean, it's no actual Wind Waker, but it's a fantastic ode to one of my favorite games of all time, nonetheless. Once in dungeons, things operate a little more simply. Exploration is fairly linear, but dungeons are filled in with loads of puzzles, hidden rooms and treasures, hidden toads, bottomless holes to fill in with your gathered confetti, unique enemy gauntlets, and of course, some amazing boss battles. No matter where you are in the game, it never feels like you're just aimlessly wandering. You always have something to do. And while you're doing that something, you'll likely find 20 other things to do along the way to keep a constant feeling of rewarding exploration and experimentation ongoing. Now, about the battles. This is the one area I feel Paper Mario and the Origami King did not live up to its potential at all. What they started with was great, and this really could be something amazing, but sadly, they just didn't flesh it out enough. Some might even go so far as to say that it's paper thin. So, let's take a look. Battle begins by approaching enemies in the overworld. If you engage them by jumping on them or hitting them with a hammer, you can start by dealing preemptive damage. Otherwise, battles just begin on a separate screen. You stand in the center of a circular arena. Enemies are then dropped onto the board in two different formations, a 1x4 line or a 2x2 square. At this point, the rings and rows are shuffled much like a Rubik's Cube in motion, and a timer begins. Within the time limit and with your set amount of moves, you must reorganize the board so the enemies end up in their original formation again, thus granting you a 1.5 times damage multiplier for when you attack. If you can't get them back in formation in time, then you simply attack as normal with no bonuses. But you can also exchange some of your money for time on the clock, though this is often not necessary. I love this part of combat, though like all areas of the combat system, it could stand to be expanded upon. The two enemy formations are the same from start to finish, as is the size of the board. I think it would offer a lot to the gameplay to introduce different formations later on, or maybe formations specific to certain enemy types, but as it is, this is all there is. Solving this puzzle is fun and sometimes even a bit challenging, but it's only a fraction of what it can be. When it is your turn to attack, you can choose to jump on or hammer your enemies. You also have some offensive items at your disposal, but I rarely made use of these. The amount of attacks you can perform per turn is equal to the amount of enemy groupings on the board, and most enemies early on can be defeated with single attacks, making the early trips into battle feel somewhat underwhelming. Since you basically always attack first, it took until about 2 to 3 hours into my playthrough before I even seen an enemy retaliate. What type of attack you're going to be using will be picked strategically based on the enemy's formation. Jumping will attack enemies in a straight line, and hitting the action button at the point of impact will add additional damage, but there's no penalty for missing an attack. Using the hammer will attack in a 2x2 square, but the distance it can reach is limited to only the two rings surrounding the center. To get a damage boost with a hammer, you must hit the action button directly before the swing down animation begins. Again, there's no penalty for missing this prompt. Similarly, there is an active block button as well. At certain points in the enemy's attack animation, you need to press the action button to negate some, but not all of their damage. Though these battles are mostly pretty easy, you'll find the enemies do have a habit of hitting like a truck if you miss your prompts. Sadly, the jumping and hammering are your only two forms of attacks. What you have from the start, again, is what you have until the end. There are different types of boots and hammers selectable from a list when choosing your attacks, and these do change how an attack can be used, but they don't change the actual attack itself. For instance, if you're against enemies with spikes on their backs, you'll want to use steel boots. This way you don't take damage when you jump on them. The attack still plays out and functions the same, but you can use it on enemies that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Different hammers just deal more damage or give money while attacking, with one special class of hammer being throwable. These alternate boots and hammers are temporary equipables, and they all have durability meters, so after a handful of attacks, they'll break, but it's not really a huge deal. You can find more in treasure chests and such, or just buy them in shops. And with the amount of money that the game gives you, you'll pretty much never be running out. I think I ran out of money once in the game, and it was because I wanted to buy a collectible, something that was purely optional, but immediately after that, I was rolling in the dough again. They went way overboard with the amount of money they give you, but I feel they were expecting you to use it for more than you really need. Replacing boots and hammers is one thing everybody will need to do semi-frequently. However, the other things you can spend money on, such as additional time for the puzzle solving or asking for help from the audience, those are such uncommon uses that whatever you would be spending there just piles up. And the game really does hand out money everywhere. Fill in holes in the ground, get money. Find toads, get money. Win battles, get money. Hit blocks, get money. Get money, get money. Spend money, get money. Well, the last one might not be that clear, but the more you spend in store, the more you can rank up your store membership. The higher your rank, the bigger your discount. A neat incentive to keep shopping, I guess, but totally unnecessary and breaks the in-game economy more than Yakuza Zero's. There is one other part of battle. A part that was shown in the earliest trailers, and a part that got many skeptical people on board. Your partners. I mentioned earlier that your group of companions rotates, and basically what this means is that every chapter you get a new partner, and by the end of the chapter they leave to be replaced by somebody else. You may think that that adds some variety, but sadly the partners are entirely passive. They all only have one attack, which they choose when to use themselves, and they don't always work, as in the partners can randomly trip up on their way to attack and miss entirely. Similarly, if you're trying to escape a battle, Mario may trip and cause you to miss a turn. I don't exactly have an issue issue with the partners tripping, as it's just another way to make attacks miss using classic RPG-styled RNG, but the lack of control for your partners is definitely a sore point for me. The only variety these guys add to battle is that their attacks look different than your own and different from each other's, and generally they have different areas of effect, but ultimately they work as nothing more than RNG bonus damage. And there was one other thing. I also said we'd be getting back to how these rescued toads can help during battle. Well, I'm sorry to keep you waiting, but depending on how much you pay them to cheer for you, they'll either solve the ring puzzle, give you items, heal you, do a small amount of damage to the enemies, or a combination of all four. It's kind of like a pay-to-cheat mechanic, but it's not sold as DLC. Now, though these battles don't evolve as they go along, you're not exactly expected to fight in every single one of them. Avoiding the enemies is not penalized, and if you're strong enough, hitting them in the overworld will just outright destroy them. At times, the lack of progression for the battle system began to wear on me, and battles would begin to feel a little tedious, so I simply avoided doing them. Absence does indeed make the heart grow fonder in an instance like this, but that's not really a good thing for the game overall. There's also some real-time battles that take place in the overworld against these giant paper-mache characters, and these can be a fun change of pace. There's not much to these really, you just need to find the stickered area on their body and whack it with a hammer, but it can be a fun puzzle in and of itself sometimes to figure out how to get to that area, especially when you get proper boss battles this way. Now maybe you also recall me saying that there's no experience system in this game to level up, but maybe you noticed that my stats haven't exactly stayed the same in all of this footage. Well, in true adventure game style, HP increases can be found around the world in the form of Legend of Zelda-esque heart containers. Sometimes they're just put out in plain sight, other times you have to go off the beaten path a bit to find them. As per other stat increases, this is where accessories come in. Accessory shops throughout the game carry gear to increase your damage output, your defense, your confetti bag size, and a few other bells and whistles. The further into the game you get, the more the shops will update to sell more powerful accessories. But there's not really much you can do with this to experiment or alter your build. There's only a few levels of each type of gear, and you'll just be buying and equipping the new ones when you see them. They do nothing for combat mechanically. Tedious as these battles may become due to their lack of progression, the boss battles are thankfully a different story altogether, and this is where the game and its battle system really begins to shine. At least it shines outside of half of the boss's physical designs.
Yeah, that'll do.
Sure, half of the bosses are just craft supplies, and while that's visually entirely lame, the battle gimmicks and strategies they inspire are actually quite wonderful. And it's not just craft supplies, a good chunk of the bosses are special enemy types known as velumentals, with a few other bosses here and there that are just completely unique to themselves. The way boss encounters work is very different from standard battles, but it does take place on the same type of arena. In these battles, the bosses take center stage while you stand on the outer ring. The goal here is to just rearrange the tiles with a set amount of time and a set amount of moves, so that the arrows lead you to the attack you need, marked by other tiles slapped on the board. These bosses all require very specific strategies that figuring out and pulling off is as challenging as it is fun. And it really can be quite challenging. This one boss here, I died on at least 4 times. That's probably the most challenge I've gotten since fighting the Smo and Ornstein clones in Code Vein. Thing is, these battles are never just running up to the enemies and hitting them with your hammer or jumping on them. They will stand in your way and litter the arena with unique stage hazards for you to plan around. Regular attacks usually aren't very effective either. At best, they are one step on the way to dealing proper damage. Often the answers come down to using these special summoning pads. See, as you defeat Vellumentals in combat, you can later summon them into battle by stepping on these pads. But in order for these pads to work, you need to activate them first by hitting the on switch. That on switch is sometimes hidden in a treasure chest or blocked off from you in some other way. So you really need to maximize what you can do in a single turn while also having your next turn planned out and ready to go right after. This to me was a way better board game than any of the Mario parties we've got in the last decade. made. But before we continue, I do want to address one complaint made by another rather prominent YouTuber. I'm not going to call this person out by name, and I'm not looking to get clout or attack them either. I don't know what possessed them to make the claim that they did, and I don't want to insinuate that it was malicious, as I have no idea. But if you heard the complaint that these boss battles are trial and error, and that the game does nothing to let you know how to beat them, please, for the love of God, strike that from the record. It is demonstrably false. Sure, you can go at these bosses in a trial and error fashion, as in try out attacks until you find out what works best, but here's the thing. If you try an attack that backfires on you, Olivia's gonna pop out and tell you why, and therein will also lie a hint in how to properly progress. If you try an attack and it randomly does a load of damage, she's gonna pop out and react excitedly and tell you why it worked. Furthermore, from the point of your very first turn and during every turn onward until the final phase is won, there are these little letters scattered on the field that if you pick them up, they will tell you in very plain and clear writing exactly what you need to do for that phase of the battle. And if that's not good enough, you can even ask Olivia for a hint during any turn. There's criticisms one can make towards these boss battles, but one thing you certainly cannot claim is that it's trial and error and that they don't tell you how to beat it. That is, quite simply, false. Normally, actually, I would complain that they tell you so much, but most of what you find out is optional, or only there to confirm what you already just learned yourself. And once you have the proper strategy, there's still a considerable level of challenge to the fight. For me, these were some of the most fun and strategic boss battles I've experienced since I first played Lost Odyssey. But then again, this type of strategizing I feel is also more akin to an adventure game than it is an RPG. So clearly, when it comes to the regular battles, it seems they only designed the foundation of the house. But they didn't bother to put up any walls or fill that house with any furniture to make it a nice cozy place you might want to spend a good deal of time in. What they have here is a great start, but it can only take you so far. The boss battles, on the other hand, are super unique, strategic, well thought out, and challenging events that makes it worth it to stick through the monotony of the normal battles. But with that, we arrive at the last chunk of the video, so let's look at some of the technical aspects of Paper Mario the Origami King. Paper Mario the Origami King is a game that oozes style. Even among its contemporaries, it stands out strongly as unique and almost fully realized. Seeing these creatures with their 2D art sprites is a treat itself. But the new origami and paper mache designs add something we'd never gotten before. But like I said, it isn't fully realized. The rare texture or effect here and there can really clash with the established art style. And most of these clashes come from the Vellumentals. Take their water effect here. It looks amazing, right? And honestly, it does. Some of the best in-game water I've ever seen, but it doesn't match the style at all. The Earth Vellumental's dirt and ground textures, however, take it a step further. They don't just manage to not match the style, but they clash with it entirely. It, in particular, is a considerable eyesore when exploring. A sore thumb that you just can't help but notice. Some font overlays, like those seen during song sections, just look really ugly too. The typography all around is terrible. Bad font choice and outlines, flat presentation. Otherwise, stuff looks dope. The world is so colorful and vibrant, it just feeds into this game's overwhelmingly charming energy. This is backed up with a pretty great OST too. Lots of cool sounds and themes used to accentuate the tone of each location, making you feel like your trek across the world is really bringing you far and wide, to radically different locations, all with their own flavors and backgrounds. The only OST complaint I had, I guess, would be the theme for Bowser's airship. While a fine theme in and of itself, it is yet another tired and done-before mock-up of Gustav Holst's classic, Mars, the Bringer of War. Again, not a bad theme, but at times you just get tired of hearing the same inspirations used over and over again. These sound effects I can't say too much on. I quite like the sound of the paper mache giants bursting apart. It feels like it was made by having somebody jump into or run through a massive pile of raked up autumn leaves, which really just makes me feel kind of cozy. But otherwise, most of what we have here just sounds like we heard it all before. They work, but that's about the extent of it. The game controls fine, and I had no issues with the button mapping over my 25 to 30 hour runtime. There is occasional slowdown, but nothing that will cause you any issues. The most slowdown comes at times when large crowds of enemies burst into confetti, which is typically right after the battle ends, so it's no biggie. And lastly, the game has a water temple that doesn't suck, so it automatically gets bonus points. With how often games mess that up, I might as well throw that in as a technical aspect, as it seems quite the technical feat to pull it off. And that's gonna be all from me, guys. The combat here can really break some people's interest in this game, and I fully understand that. But the issues I had with the game in that department were intermittent enough that it hardly deterred my experience. And everything else in the game shines so bright that where the combat left me down felt like just a little pale shadow that was pretty easy to overlook in the grand scheme of things. I fully believe when this year comes to a close that this is going to be on my 10 favorite games of the year list. The question now is, how high is it going to be? Because I really did adore my time with Paper Mario the Origami King. And if you guys enjoyed this video, you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe, and share the video if you can. Links to all my socials and the Patreon support page are in the description below, and as always, folks, thanks for watching. COVID cut has got to go. COVID cut has got to go.